everyone, happy 2023, woo! It's really been dreary out. You know, this has not been a good start to the year, but it's okay because right now we're going to reflect on last year and specifically on the books that I read. So last year in 2022, I turned 20 at the end of the year, and coincidentally, I also read 20 books. So before we go into the specific books, I wanted to share how I track my reading, which is actually with the website StoryGraph. And I love this website. Like, it is so useful. It gives you so much like statistics on like your reading preferences, including genre, mood, like page length, pacing, all that type of good stuff. So it's really fun and interesting to look at. And so that's what I'm going to be using right now to discuss what I read last year. So starting off with the mood, so it collects from all of the books I read. My top 3 moods were emotional, sad, and reflective. So I think that's pretty accurate. The next 2 were dark and then finally hopeful. And I think that is, again, I mean, it has to be accurate because that's what I did read, but I do really tend to gravitate towards books that are more like, I don't know, that just make me sad and make me think a lot. But already this year, for 2023, I think I will be reading a bit more like hopeful books, just to brighten things up, but you never know. And moving onwards, we have the pace of books, and I read the majority of medium-paced books and then slow-paced books and no fast-paced books. And I completely agree with this as well because I love a slow-paced book, especially for like movies and stuff too. Maybe not TV shows as much since you know, TV shows have a lot of episodes going on, but something about having like a slower pace just really helps to focus on certain aspects and details that usually would be like glossed over. And I do like reading fast-paced books sometimes, but last year I didn't read any, so. And moving on, this is kind of similar, I would say, to the pacing is with the page numbers. So the majority of books I read were 300 to 499 pages, which is, you know, right down the middle. And then I had less than 300 in second, and then my third was over 500 pages. Because, you know, it is kind of a hard commitment reading longer books, but they are generally very worth it, as I will get to when we discuss the books, because I read this year my favorite and the best book I've ever read in my entire life, and I sincerely doubt that any book is going to top it. Yeah. Then moving on to fiction and nonfiction, I read 19 fiction books and only 1 nonfiction. So that's kind of one of my reading goals in 2023 is to read more nonfiction because I think it can be really valuable and really interesting. And then now for another fun part is genres. So the top one is LGBTQIA+, which I don't think this should be a genre, and hold me out. Yeah, do I want it to be my top? Yes, but all of these genres that you can see, literary, contemporary, maybe not so much classics, but young adult, all of these genres can have LGBT in it. Like, why is it its own genre? Because you can take any genre. Those could have the themes or topics of LGBTQ issues or people. So like, why is it its own genre? But anyway, then for most read authors, we have Leigh Bardugo, of course, as you can see over here. And then I also have F. Scott Fitzgerald. And then for this last little section, we have the tracking of how many books I read and the pages per month. As you can see, it was like very sporadic, and you can also trace this with my academic schedule, because as you can see in April, when we're getting to May, there was no time for anything. So things kind of tanked a little bit. Although in February I read more books, March was definitely more fruitful because that's when I read my favorite book. Yeah, it kind of went up too over the breaks, as you can see, towards November and December. And then finally we have the star ratings, and these are self-evaluated. It's not like the general ratings. So you can rate your books and you can leave reviews and stuff. So as you can see, my average rating is 4.09 stars. I think usually, I don't know, I think I'm a kind of nice reviewer, but it is kind of spaced out, as you can see. But my 5 stars are very, very specific. I could super love a book, but maybe the writing wasn't as like good as it could have been, or there wasn't, you know, just little details, and then it will be like 4.75 or 4.5. But with the 5-star books, these are books that I would like hail as like, I think everyone should read these. And again, this is my opinion. Everyone rates their books very differently, but that's just how I do mine. So yeah, let's get into what I actually read. Okay, starting off with the first book I read it was last year, 2022, is Crooked Kingdom by Leigh Bardugo. And if I'm looking over here, that's because I have my reviews on my laptop. But I rated this book 4.5 stars because I super enjoyed it, and I thought it was very detailed, very exciting, very adventurous. But I didn't rate it as highly as Six of Crows because I just thought the plot wasn't as like interesting to me. I was more like engaged in the first book. Okay, the next book I read, which took me longer than Crooked Kingdom, was This Side of Paradise by F. Scott Fitzgerald, even though it is like 1/3 of the size. But basically, okay, I love The Great Gatsby, of course. That was the first F. Scott Fitzgerald book I've ever read. And I was obsessed with it when I read it, like, loved it. So I wanted to give another book of his a chance. And the whole, like, premise of the back of this one is, like, following this, you know, young man who's going into the army in the 20s. But that plot accounts for, like, I can't even remember, but it was like this much of the book compared to the whole rest of the plot. I just thought it was like extremely boring, not slow paced, but it was just very, very boring. And all the characters were unlikable. Like there wasn't a single character that I was like, oh, this is a good person. I still love Fitzgerald, but this one was not a good one in my opinion. And it was my lowest ranked. I started 2.75. Next up, I read After Dark by Haruki Murakami, and this is the second book I have read by him. I really liked the first one I read, which was Norwegian Wood, and he has obviously published a lot of books that are very popular, so I wanted to give it another shot. And this one was good. It's all based around one day, so, you know, all the events take place in literally one night, and I thought it was, like, really interesting. There were a lot of, like, turns that I wasn't expecting the novel to take, and I was like, oh, what's gonna happen? So it was very interesting. I do wish it was like a little longer because I feel like it started getting like really interesting at a certain point, but by then things were already kind of wrapping up because it was the end of the novel. But it did leave on a very open note, so just following that, I would have liked if it was a little bit longer, but it did get me thinking. The next book I read was You've Reached Sam by Dustin Thao, and I don't even have this book. I don't know where it went. Was this the digital one? Did I have it and just get rid of it? I don't know. That's how big of an impression it left on me. I'm sorry. Okay, it was okay. Nothing really like stood out. However, it did actually make me cry at the end. Like, I cry very easily at things, but it did make me cry. So I was like pretty emotionally invested, but there were just too many questions that you couldn't ignore. Not really like how it worked, but why couldn't they do more with it? Okay, next up was Loki, Where Mischief Lies by Mackenzie Leigh. This one was just for fun because like I really like Marvel, I like Loki, so I wanted to see what more to him, you know, I could gain because there's only so much media. But I really enjoyed this book. It was fun. I really like Mackenzie Leigh because she wrote the oh, they're in the corner. The Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue. Like, she wrote those books back there. So I did like the writing style. I thought it was like fun, but it was just very like surface level, and I didn't feel like I like gained anything new about the character. And the plot was exactly like the TV show. I don't know the time frame of when the TV show came out and when this book came out, but it just felt like reading it in a different font, and it wasn't as exciting. Okay, I'm literally gonna cry. Like, my eyes are getting watery, but we have finally made it to my favorite book of the year. I'm literally gonna cry. It was A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. Okay, I'm sure you have heard about this, and before you even think about reading it, as I'm sure you have also heard, look up trigger warnings, because this novel covers basically every single sensitive topic you could ever think of. Like, it is so dark in like the subject matter, but I can't even like describe how much I love this book. I did write a review on my StoryGraph, and I will leave screenshots of it here, so like please feel free to pause it if you would like to read it. I will say there are spoilers, nothing like too plot heavy in this review, but it just like the way it made me feel. I just basically wrote about the reading experience, and I of course rated this 5 stars. Like, it was the most real book I've ever read. Like, while reading it, I felt like I was literally just watching the events unfold. It didn't even feel like I was reading it because of how like fluid the lines were, and every character felt extremely real and believable. Like, it's also a Bildungsroman, I'm pretty sure that's how you pronounce it, but it follows like the characters from an early age all the way like through their entire lives. So, and it's pretty long. Like, this book was about 800 pages, so you're with these characters for a very long time and feel very, very, very like connected to them, and I felt like I knew them personally. That's how like deep this got, and that's not even covering what even happens. That's just talking about like the individual characters and little details. But yeah, this was, I would be very hesitant recommending it to certain people because it's extremely dark. Like, you definitely have to be at least an adult to read it. I wouldn't read it if I was like, maybe in high school I think it would be okay, but anything younger than that, no, it's way too sensitive and dark. Like, another way I could describe it is like, it was the like saddest, most heartbreaking and like painful novel, but it was written in the most beautiful way, which makes it so conflicting because it was so painful to read, but it was one of the most beautiful things I've ever read. So that's how I feel about this. Again, here are the screenshots of my review. But yeah, this book, I literally stopped reading for a time after this because I couldn't even compare anything else to it because it was so impactful. And even now I still like, especially for my 5-star reads, I'm like, if you can't get to this level, like, you're not worth it, I'm sorry. But it definitely is not for everyone, and do your own research before you read it, because the reason I jumped into it was the only thing I heard was, I would never recommend this to anyone, this is the saddest book I've ever read. So of course, since I read like sad books, I'm like, oh, I want to read it. But even knowing that it was gonna be like the saddest thing ever, like, I still wasn't prepared, and oh my god. Also, for weeks after reading this, I could not like get it out of my head. Like, it really like stuck with me, being like the only thing I could think about. And while I was reading it too, like every single second I wasn't reading it, I was like still so into the lives of these characters and wanted to just keep reading. But there were parts that were like so painful that I had to physically set the book down and walk away because it filled me with that much like pain and like, or anger or sadness. So it was definitely a long read, and I would say like it's best to take your time with this. Like, there's no need to rush it. But yeah, I did cry a lot, as well as can be expected. Okay, so after that book, I was very skeptical about any other book I was gonna read because I just can't compare them. But I decided to read something I am very fond of but have never read, of course, which is The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux. And, okay, first of all, this cover's like very cool, right? I don't know, Barnes & Noble Classic, okay. But I rated this book 3.5 stars. I love the musical Phantom of the Opera, which is why I think a lot of people, you know, including myself, read this book. However, of course, the musical is based, it's an adaptation of the novel. So I wanted to go back to the source material, and oh my god. First of all, there's a lot of stuff that's extremely similar, like almost all the way down to like the lines, or I was like, oh, that's in the musical. But then it goes crazy. Like, I was disturbed reading this. Oh yeah, so this review was at the beginning of the book, which I just think like perfectly captures it, which is Weber's version downplays the horror, and Weber is the creator of the musical. So the musical's version downplays the horror and fright of Leroux's story in its earlier film adaptation and turns the story into a sweeping romance. This alteration probably accounts for much of the play's popularity, but those familiar only with Weber's incarnation can be surprised to learn of the ghoulish overtones of the original novel and its previous adaptations. Nonetheless, it was the 1988 Broadway musical that propelled the story of the Phantom to the mythic status it enjoys today. So I completely agree. Like, this book is so dark and different, but it was of course needed. But the musical, however, did do huge favors in popularizing it. Even now, it's one of the longest running Broadway shows, and it's been running for about 35 years and is only closing this year in 2023. So it was definitely fun reading this as a musical fan, but it was creepy. Okay, next we have We Were the Lucky Ones by Georgia Hunter. And sadly, I bent the cover of this book. I don't know if you can tell. Wait. It's like towards the top. I don't think you can tell, but it was very, oh, right there, right there. Anyway, this book was really good. I rated it 4 stars, and I think if I knew more about it going into it, then I would have loved it even more. It basically follows a very large family's history during World War II. And what makes this even more, like, crazy to read is that it is actually a huge, like, catalog of the author's own family history. Of course, this is a fictional book, so some things are fictionalized, but there's a lot of research that's included at the back of the book, including, like, you know, this character was based off of her, you know, her ancestor and things like that. And it was insane, like, knowing that these very specific stories were, like, tied to the author. But yeah, I thought it was really good. I did think it was just a little, it took me a while to get, like, really attached to the characters just because there were so many of them. It was kind of hard to keep it straight, but I do definitely recommend this. Now for the next book, I have On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong, and this is the first work I've ever read by this author, and I know he is extremely popular, especially with his poetry. However, this is one of his novels. Is it his only novel or first novel? I am unsure. But it definitely has inspired me to, like, read his poetry because the way this was written was just, like, so beautiful. Sadly, from this point in 2023, I do not remember anything that happened in this book. That's not a say of the book, because usually my memory is pretty bad when it comes to, like, plots and stuff like that. Like, I think if I read it again, I would gain a lot more from it, because I don't quite remember it. Still very poetic and, like, non-linear, and it also was very character driven, which I do like when it comes to books. Okay, now similar to On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, with The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller, I feel like I would really love it a second time through, because this is, like, a huge book. In my StoryGraph recap, I think it was one of the most popular books that I personally had read, like, by other reviewers. But at this point, I don't remember, like, anything about this book. I'm sorry, it just didn't, like, stick with me, but it was, like, really good, really well written. I thought the characters were very interesting, and the plot was, like, super intense and interesting as well. Like, the stakes were super, super high. And I know that this is a huge book that people love, like, everywhere, especially, like, other things by her. So I think I need to give either this a try or another book by her a try. But I'm glad I read it because it is so talked about in the book community. Now, coming up with a classic here, I have Their Eyes Are Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. And I was first, like, drawn to this novel because I really love classics, and I've heard of this one through, like, my English classes over the years. So I wanted to check it out, and I thought it was, like, really good. I really liked the characters, and I really also enjoyed, let's see. Oh yeah, it was, like, the contrast between, like, the dialogue and the narration was, like, really interesting to read. And it had a lot of meaning to it. The only thing I didn't really like about this novel is that it wasn't, like, very interesting. Like, the reading process, I always have to be like, okay, I'm gonna, like, make myself read a chapter of this. Like, I wasn't ever like, oh, I really want to keep reading and see what's gonna happen until, like, either it was the very end or, like, one of the high points of the novel. But I had a difficult time, like, staying engaged in this book, but I am still really glad that I read it. Okay, now for a second 5-star book that I read this year, and I think this is the only other 5-star book that I rated this year, was Johnny Got His Gun by Dalton Trumbo. This is another one that was just, like, crazy. Like, again, I'll include my review of this one as well because it's really long, and most of it are just, like, huge quotes of passages, because so many things I would just read and be like, what the, like, I had to take a second and process what was going on in the narrator's mind, because oh my god. I basically just started with, this is by far one of the most gripping revealing, moving, and call to action pieces of work I've ever read, especially as far as anti-war novels go. The way the book is structured is it's the main character's like stream of I can't say this word, consciousness? It's like his stream of conscious. Yeah, it follows like the present, speculations on the future, as well as like memories from the past. And the way that it's written is, it's almost like you're just falling down a river. There's no stopping. Things just like run into you. It was just a very like moving book that just felt like so fast paced and just in your face with like the amount of atrocities that have happened to this character, and just of course through like war. Yeah, let's see. It was each sentence and chapter seamlessly blends into the other in a stream of consciousness, creating a myriad of memories, contemplations, present thoughts, tangents, and future speculations. And that's my review. But there were so many things I was like, what? Especially, I'm gonna read the whole review even though you can read it. Oh my gosh, I can't even describe it. Let's see. Oh, so there were just a lot of like super thought-provoking ideas like regarding war, and one of them that was in the first part of the book was, this is me, but as he points out, there's an absurd contradiction that war thrives on, which is people in power saying that a man will have to die in order to protect his life, prompting the question of why then should he be willing to die for the privilege of living? Because you should be willing to die for your country, but you were fighting for the right to live, which is only granted through death. Like, it's crazy. And I think this was, of course, like it says on the reviews, it was like very pivotal during the Vietnam War era, and especially like during any war era, I would assume. I would definitely recommend this if you have or haven't read any type of like war, or especially anti-war novels. But this was fantastic, and it was so disturbing. Okay, next up, moving away from that genre, we have, I don't have a copy of this, I gave it to my mom to borrow to read, but it's Anxious People by Fredrik Backman, and I haven't read A Man Called Ove, I don't know what it's called, but I haven't read any other books by him, so this was my first one that I read by him through a friend's like recommendation, and I thought it was really good. Like, it was really interesting. There were a lot of parts that like really made me chuckle, because it's kind of just like a comedy, but it's like a little quirky, it's a bit weird, and I think it has also like inspired me to read more from him, because I do like the way it was written. Of course it's translated, but I do like the style that it was written in. Okay, next up we have a weird book, which is Earthlings by Sayaka Murata, and first of all, this cover is so cute. So I'm pretty sure I'd seen this from somewhere, either like a video or a post or something, and I was like, oh, this sounds weird. Like, the main character literally believes that she's an alien, and so I'm like, that's an interesting perspective to have among humans, right? It goes weird places, let me tell you, weird. Like, even from the get-go, you're like, okay, this is different. It just goes down like a freaking like snowball. What's that saying? Like, it just really gains as it keeps going, and it gets even weirder. By the end, I was like shocked, like jaw on the ground. I rated this one 4.25. I didn't rate it 5 stars because I'm actually not sure why I didn't rate this higher than 4.25. I think it was just because measuring up to the last 2 5-star books, it wasn't just the same like gravity, but it was like really, really weird. I thought it was really similar to Ken Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, because I had read that before, and the whole idea with this character being like different and experiencing the world differently, viewing society as like a machine, something that like people are just like stuck doing, as opposed to like a human actually like living and going through these processes. I just thought like the narrator was extremely similar to the main character in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and I really enjoyed that book too. So this one was a great read if you're looking for something like interesting and disturbing and like kind of like witty almost. I don't know, it was weird, but I would recommend it. Okay, now moving on to a Stephen King novel, we have Mr. Mercedes, and this one is like really good. I've only read 2 other Stephen King novels before, which were The Outsider and Misery. Misery is definitely my favorite out of the ones I've read, but this one was good. The only thing is, like, whenever you read Stephen King, you know, you gotta take it with like a grain of salt, because his characters are just like you'll have like a normal, decent, average character, and then just like randomly there's like so many like sexist and racist things that these characters like think and like say, but it has like nothing related to like the novel. Like, is this about like sexism or racism? No, but like it's what all the characters like do without, I don't know. I think it's just like Stephen King's insert. This is kind of like with Murakami too. A lot of people think that he's very like misogynistic in the way that he writes. And as I am now on his the third novel that I've read for Murakami, like I'm starting to see like really weird things pop up where these are just like average characters, but then they just have like the weirdest thoughts that I'm like, that doesn't even like sound like the character speaking. Like it just sounds like an insert of the author's like views. Like for this, every time there's any type of like female character, he immediately like scans the body, like describes every single detail, like especially their chest. I'm just like, why was that needed? This is like a stranger, like a character you see once that has one line, but then the author like feels like, oh, the main character should describe like every single aspect of this person's body. Like it was just really weird. And especially with the like racist tendencies, like there were so many just like slurs that I'm like, why does this like white character feel the need to say this? And it doesn't even, I don't know, it was just really weird. It's like very bizarre. I need to read other reviews and see if people like felt the same way, but it was just like, why did he write these people like this? Like he's like heightening all these like issues, but it's not a comment on anything. I did rate this book 4 stars, but now as I'm like remembering it, I think I maybe should lower it a little bit, because those things just kind of overshadow, even though the plot was fantastic, I was involved, the way it was written was just like, why is he saying these things? It was very bizarre, to say the least. Okay, moving away from that, we have one of my favorite books of the year. This was a 4.5-star read for me, which was in One Last Stop by Casey McQuiston. This book was just it was really good. I really enjoyed it. I thought the plot was interesting, the characters were great, and this was the first WLW book I have like ever read, at least like specifically targeting out to read. So it was very good. I would definitely recommend. Okay, now going back to kind of the beginning of the year, we have another Leigh Bardugo book, which is King of Scars, and I really enjoyed this. Like, it does, all of her books do just feel like a giant continuation. Like that's how my brother describes it, especially because I'm like, oh, did you like this one or the second one, Rule of Wolves, better? And he's like, well, it's kind of just like the same thing. Like the plots are continued. It's not like one and then the other. So I think that's like a plus of her books, but it's kind of a con because each one I'm reading, it's like not the same thing, but it's like, oh, it's kind of the same thing, but it was still really good. And I haven't read the second one the second one after this yet, but it left off on a huge cliffhanger. I'm just interested to see like if my predictions about certain things are gonna happen in the one after this. But yeah. Okay, now the only digital book I actually read this year was The Curious Case of Benjamin Button by F. Scott Fitzgerald. I had heard of the story before, but I didn't know it was written by Fitzgerald, and also didn't really, I don't know, I didn't understand like that it was a full like short story, and I still haven't seen the movie. I'd only heard of the plot before, but this book took me by surprise. Like, it was such a weird idea. Like, I'm sure you've heard of it before, but a baby is born as a full like elderly man, and as he goes through his years, he's getting younger. The idea is already like, oh, this is weird, and I thought it was just gonna be like, oh, this is like funny and so odd, but it got super depressing and like dark, and a huge like comment on society's like obsession with like age and like beauty and youth, and especially the idea of like, oh, you're a certain age, you should act like it, you should look like it. Like, now I'm 20, like I should look like a 20-year-old, act like a 20-year-old. I'm not gonna act like I'm 10 years old. I'm not gonna act like I'm 70, like that type of thing. But it really made you think, like, who's like prescribing these ideas? It's society. But yeah, it was like really interesting. And there was also a really interesting thing that was like the idea that like, you know, acting and looking youthful is like really valued. You know, even if you're like, say you're 30 or 40, and then it's like, oh, you don't look like you're over 20, and like you act like so young, and that's something that's like idolized. But as you get older, like, you're not gonna want society doesn't want like a 7-year-old like acting like a 20-year-old. Like people will like be like, oh, be yourself, be whatever, until it's like past what they expect from you. So this book like really made me think a lot, and I would really recommend reading it. There's a lot of really interesting quotes in it as well. Okay, now we're already second to last book, which is Home, a Memoir of My Early Years by Julie Andrews. So this is the only nonfiction book that I had read this year, and it was so good. Like, okay, my favorite movie of all time is The Sound of Music. And then when I saw that Julie Andrews had written a memoir, I was like, yeah, I need to read it. This is the first in a set of 2, I'm pretty sure, that she has. The next one is called Homework, and it's her Hollywood years. And this one is like from her birth, basically, like from when the time she was a child to Broadway and right before she makes it like over to Hollywood. So I think as far as like my engagement level, if I had started with the Hollywood one, I would have maybe been more engaged, because that's what I know of her. Like I know, you know, Mary Poppins, Sound of Music, you know, her stuff with like Disney. But I am really glad I read this one, because I didn't know anything about her early life, like how she was brought up, like her start in the industry with how she started so young, and also just like the talent that she like innately possessed, but also worked so hard on finessing like her entire life. I will say, like, it was really slow at the beginning, because she was like, oh, my great grandfather, blah 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 blah, and I'm like, you don't need to, like, I know it's like for her own self-preservation, you know, like she wants to legicize these like people in her life, but I was like, I don't need to know like the name of this person that had like this one farm. Like, I don't know, that sounds really mean, I'm sorry, Julie. But once we got kind of like moving, especially when she was like making her way to America to be on Broadway in My Fair Lady, which I haven't even listened to My Fair Lady before, so it was really interesting. Okay, we have finally made it to the 20th book of 2022, which was Last Night at the Telegraph Club by Malinda Lo. And it was so good! Okay, I was drawn to this for 3 reasons. Number 1, it is specifically a WLW book, so I was like, need to know about that. Number 2, it's set in San Francisco, Chinatown, and I'm from San Francisco. Well, I was born in San Francisco, so I was, you know, of course, like, I wanted to learn more about the location. And number 3, it is a historical fiction. So it's not only Chinatown in San Francisco, but it's in the 1950s. And it's WLW. So I'm like, that sounds like a very, like, interesting mix, because, of course, in the 50s, like, the amount, and of course till now too, but just the amount of, like, prejudice towards race and as well as sexual orientation, like, in the 50s, I wanted to especially read about that, because at the back of this book there's actually a lot of research that the author has done, of course, to write the book, but she's included it. And it was one of my favorite sections was Chinatown and Chinese Americans, and then another one, lesbians, gender, and community. So it was like really interesting reading about the historical aspects that influenced, of course, her fictionalized version of this. And it also has a Stonewall Book Award, which means it has extremely high merit in depicting the lives of people of the LGBT community. So that's really cool, and I don't know if she's written more. Wait, I think she has. Wait, I'm going back on that. Oh yeah, she has, her first novel is Ash, a sapphic retelling of Cinderella. So those were, well, these aren't all of them, I put some of them back, but those are all the books that I read in 2022, the 20 books. I really enjoyed reading last year. Like, I felt like I read a lot of like really good quality books over quantity, but a lot of these have like stuck with me, especially A Little Life, Johnny Got His Gun, One Last Stop. Like, okay, One Last Stop, compared to those two, you can't really compare them, but I just read a lot of books that I was really like interested in and made me think a lot, which is what I really value in reading. So thank you for watching. I hope you had books that you really loved last year, and I hope that we both are able to find ones this year that we really love as well.